I would want to jump into the idea of how Jesus spoke in code.
Vivekananda puts it really nice, who was a Swami in the late 1800s. He says, to the masses who could not conceive of anything higher than a personal God, he said, pray to your Father in heaven. To others who could grasp a higher idea, he said, I am the vine, you are the branches. But to his disciples, to whom he revealed himself more fully, he proclaimed the highest truth. I and my Father are one. He's using parables as a literary device to cloak the deeper truth, whereas when he's with the disciples, when he's with the homies, with whom they're spending all their time, around the campfire at night, that's when we get, I'm the way, the truth, and the light. He says in John, before Abraham was, I am. He's not talking about this body, this man, Jesus. That's impossible. He's talking about his own, maybe to use a more contemporary term here, his own unity consciousness. In my view, he's a non-dual mystic master.
All right, we are rolling, and I'm here with my friend Bob Peck. How's it going this morning?
What's up, Matt? Thanks for having me back, brother.
Absolutely. For the listeners, this will be a part 2. We did a part 1 a few months ago. We got a lot into Jesus as a potential yogi, as someone who had traveled to the East, and into a lot more modern messiahs, all kind of exciting stuff. So if you guys want to hear more, please go back and listen to part 1. This will be part 2, and we're going to get into more of Jesus' teachings and who he was and that type of thing. Bob, you're somewhat of an expert. I think you called yourself a student in our pre-chat, as many of us are, myself included. But you did write a book called Original Sin is a Lie, which is an incredible title. And you know quite a lot about this guy. And I wanted to get into that with you. Totally, man. I mean, he's an awesome teacher, awesome wisdom bearer. So I'm excited to learn more. Thanks for being here. And let's get into it. How do you want to start this thing?
Thanks, man. Yeah, I grew up Easter, Christmas Christian. I went twice a year, and I think that's why I liked it, because I didn't go every day and every Wednesday and Sunday like some of our brothers and sisters. But I always appreciated him. I kind of stopped calling myself Christian in my late teen years because I had some issues with exclusivity, still do, and certain doctrines of Christianity. But I really deeply revere and honor Jesus and his teachings of, in my view, unconditional love, barrier breaking, boundary breaking. Essentially, in my view, he's a non-dual mystic master, and there's a lot of parallels in his teachings to other masters, Krishna, Buddha, Lao Tzu, across the line, men and women throughout history, basically, who have broken the veil, so to speak. There's a lot of similarities, and so that that's in the book, certainly, but I definitely do devote a few chapters to kind of Bible context and kind of his, really the early Judeo-Christian world, the Greco-Roman world in which he lived and died. And I studied in school. I guess my qualifications are: I have a bachelor's, a humble bachelor's in religious studies. I have a concentration in New Testament and formative Christianity. So, took a good deal of classes on Jesus, on Paul, and the Apocrypha, the Gospels that didn't make it.
Okay.
The Bible, which is also interesting stuff. But I think in terms of where I would start, understanding the first century of the Roman Empire, I think is really important. What was he born into, right? So ancient Judea was a province of the Roman Empire. Augustus was Caesar Augustus was the emperor, and he was called Son of God, by the way. on all the coins of that
Interesting.
period. So the Roman Empire was a kind of state religion, if you will. The emperor was this divine figure, and essentially the Jews lived in Galilee and Judea. Jerusalem was their capital city. Jesus was, according to the Gospels, born in Bethlehem. Some scholars actually dispute that. They actually there's a pretty healthy argument that he actually was just born and raised in Nazareth, and so yeah, he's kind of in this. It's not quite backwater. I think that's been the perception for millennia, but we've discovered recently in the last 100 years a pretty prominent city called Sepphoris, which was a bustling, not quite metropolis, not quite Jerusalem, but an active city. And Nazareth essentially is a suburb of Sepphoris. So he's on the outskirts, but he's still, he's not quite the country bumpkin that we once kind of considered him. But
he's out in Dripping Springs.
Right, exactly. Just outside of town. And Joseph is a carpenter, and so he's very likely kind of an artisan. He's an artisan apprentice, and his ministry begins at 30 when he is baptized by his cousin, his big cuz John the Baptist. Who very likely was an Essene, right? So in first century Judea, there's a pretty wide variety of Judaism, sects of Judaism. You have the temple Jews in Jerusalem, who are called the Sadducees. Herod the Great was the king of that of the Jewish province. He was a Jewish king, kind of working in line with the emperor, but as a provincial governor, essentially. Herod built a very beautiful, or I should say rebuilt, a magnificent structure. Ancient Jerusalem in that period was undergoing a very significant level of building projects. And so the temple is basically the spiritual home, spiritual heart of the ancient Jews. It's very prominent in their religion and their culture, and that's the temple Jews. That's kind of the predominant denomination, if you will. You also have another sect called the Pharisees, which you might be familiar with that word. We can get into them. They're kind of more. They're not quite as close to the temple as the Sadducees, but they do have a level of religious authority. They basically traveled throughout the province as kind of powerful teachers and so on. And then you have the Essenes, who are out in the wilderness. And the Essenes are basically an apocalyptic sect of Judaism. Well, what does that mean? So it essentially means that they are anticipating a coming of an end of days, or an end of the current power structure. The first century Judea is a powder keg, Matt, basically. There's a lot of Jewish animosity against Rome and against the Roman Empire for being the controllers, being the police, essentially, of their land. And the Essenes are, a bit more militant in their religious views, in this kind of anticipatory, this kind of coming. And we know that from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were a cache of texts that we discovered in the last century, in the 40s. And they talk a lot about it's Essene literature, essentially talking about the sons of light at war with the sons of darkness. And eventually, maybe we'll get to this, but eventually there's a Jewish revolt after Jesus' death. It's right around when the Gospels are written. And just for, kind of context of the timeline here, Jesus is born in approximately 4 BCE, right after the death of King Herod. And his life is in those essentially first few decades of the first century. He's baptized at 30 by John the Baptist, who's an Essene, who's talking about kind of this prophetic call of the coming of the end of days. And, you know, in all 4 Gospels, Jesus starts his ministry by getting baptized with John. There's kind of a spiritual moment there that's even potentially witnessed by other people in the surrounding area. And with the Holy Spirit, that there's this kind of light, mystical experience there, and he starts teaching. And ultimately, we have 4 Gospels about that period of his life. It's about 3 years or so before his execution. And he's I'm happy to go into a lot of directions. I know you and I had talked about kind of why is he. Maybe another good place to start is like, why do we care? Like, why are we still talking about this guy?
Right.
From a statistical standpoint, he's pretty unremarkable. He's in the kind of peasant class, so to speak. He has no royalty or aristocracy. At least in the traditional socioeconomic way, he's pretty uninteresting historically, which is a kind of a counter to the fact that he's arguably the most influential human of modern civilization, certainly of Western civilization, right?
Right.
And so why are we talking about him? In my view, it's because of what he taught. His teachings, his ethical teachings, were so profound that he forced us to think and contemplate, essentially our relationship to God, our relationship to one another. And he did so in a way that called out the religious institution of the day. He kind of consistently calls out the Pharisees for being hypocritical in their religious leadership, and he kind of has some issues with the way that they are living their lives. And so kind of in contrast to, I think, what a lot of people, and I think certainly a lot of Christians would say, the reason we're talking about him is because of his miracles and because he resurrected from the dead and saved us of our sins. And in my view, those are actually less important in some ways. I'm open to the resurrection. We'll get there. I think, a professor told me once that the reason we're still talking about Jesus is because of his radical teaching style. That was so profound. So I'm happy to give you a few examples.
100%. Well, I have a quick question about the baptism and the mystical experience that even other people may have seen. That's the first I've heard of that. Of course, I heard about his baptism, which, I believe in our last podcast, we both kind of got to this idea that he was potentially a normal guy that grew into the Jesus that we know, which I think is an interesting idea. But yeah, it sounds like maybe his spiritual rebirth happened around this baptism. What was it maybe that happened that what was so mystical other than the traditional ritual of baptism?
Yeah, well, baptism actually was an ancient Jewish ritual. It definitely, the ancient Jews have this kind of, maybe obsession is too strong a word, but a core component of their spirituality has to deal with water and its purification. And that's, fairly actually common in a lot of ancient religion and ancient cultures, kind of the washing of sins or the cleaning of your past inequities. And there's essentially clean and unclean. Clean and unclean is a core part of the ancient Jewish religion. So, it's a spiritual ritual to have kind of a teacher perform that process. And what happens in Mark is actually the first gospel in terms of its when it was written. The New Testament, the collection of stories about Jesus, the second part of the Bible, is it opens with Matthew, but Matthew is actually the second gospel from the most likely second gospel from biblical scholarship, putting the pieces together, because Matthew has the birth narrative, as does Luke. So it makes more sense as a book to start with the birth narrative, but technically Mark is the first one. And Mark's gospel begins, it opens with the baptism. It doesn't have the birth narrative, doesn't have anything about his childhood. He's just 30 years old, being baptized in the Jordan by his cousin John. And it's again, the gospels are we're talking about this, they're hagiography, right? Which means that they are any kind of stories about saints or religious figures have this tendency to be miraculously colored and so on, which is not journalism. I do think there are reliable aspects to these documents, otherwise I wouldn't be so hypnotized by them. But yeah, I mean, even in Mark, which is the first gospel, which is the most the least spectacular, if you will, John being the most spectacular, the heavens open up when Jesus is baptized, and the Holy Spirit descends like a dove. Wow. I think it probably was a pretty profound experience for potentially the onlookers, but certainly for Jesus himself. It was kind of his, the Joseph Campbell, the hero's quest. It's like, this is the beginning, this is the start. He's kind of done his training, maybe in other places. We talked about that a little bit, that he might have gone to other regions like India and so on. We don't have a ton of evidence for that, but I'm open to that. But he was a kid, and he studied under under Joseph in the carpenter shop. He kind of did his prayers and contemplations and so on. And then when he gets baptized, it's like, okay, you're 30, you're ready to go, you're ready to teach. And that's where it really starts.
So when you say like a dove, what potentially was a dove the actual animal present in that scene?
Yeah, I mean, doves are symbolic of the Holy Spirit. So the Spirit descends like a dove. I mean, to quote Mark, there's a lot of like Renaissance paintings of a white light, white bird that's present there.
Gotcha.
I think it's indicative of like his purity, or his purity of the baptism ritual.
Well, that's cool.
There's a lot of symbols in mystic.
Yeah. Well, like a lot of people who have had mystical experiences through whatever means, sometimes there is this connection with nature that occurs. For myself, it has been the wind blowing when you say a certain thing. It's like, yo, I'm feeling like boom. And you say like a personal truth, and the wind's like, it's like, whoa, okay, well, maybe that has something to it, so it makes me feel a little like when you say the heavens opened up, potentially it was cloudy and the sun was kind of away, and then as the baptism occurs, you maybe get some of those sun rays, and the clouds dissipate, and synchronistically a dove flies nearby, and everyone's like, whoa, and that's not too far-fetched to believe. When we kind of say the heavens open up, it could conjure images of parting the Red Sea. Could you really do that? Maybe, I don't know. But when you think of it in just a sense of like nature synchronicity, I think it gives a little bit more of weight to the story and possibility that these things really occurred, and they're more than just myths, so I just wanted to put that part out there.
But that's great. I mean, it's a beautiful image in his, to start us off. And he essentially starts, he travels throughout the countryside. He goes around teaching a variety of things. He uses a teaching style called parables, which I'm sure most, American Christian, American post-Christians are familiar with, where essentially what he's saying, we had just talked about this, but what he's saying is, oftentimes so dangerous in terms of it being blasphemy, in terms of it being, he's walking a tightrope here, that using parables was actually a very sophisticated literary device to kind of shroud the deeper meaning of what he was saying. And so, let me give you one of my favorites. I have two favorite parables that I talk about in my book. I'll give you the shortened version here today. One is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so, for context on this parable, a man comes up to Jesus and asks him questions, right? And so typically what happens with all of these ancient teachers and really modern teachers, but certainly ancient, is that folks come up and kind of ask questions like, can you heal my daughter? Or like, solve this internal spiritual debate I'm having, or they get challenged. Some people say, oh, you think you're so holy and highly, it happens to Buddha quite often in his life story. People are kind of constantly coming up to these guys and gals. And the way that the Good Samaritan parable goes is he says, it's in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, which is the least Jewish of the four. He says, an expert in the law says, teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And, is it a pop quiz? Is it a spiritual question? That's a sincere ask. And Jesus answers, what's written in the law? How do you read it? And the man paraphrases it by saying, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus agrees. And he basically says, that's correct. Do this and you will live. And the man says, seeking, clarification here, who is my neighbor? What do you mean? What do we mean by loving our neighbor as ourself? And so he says, he tells the story. A man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers. He was, kind of robbed and beaten up and left for dead. And a priest later is walking by. A Jewish priest is walking by the man, who sees the injured man, who could be dead, and passes by on the other side. Not only does he just walk by, he actually crosses the road in Jesus' story here and keeps going. And this is because, again, back to the clean, unclean, there were laws in the Old Testament that were essentially warnings against touching or working with dead people that the priest was aware of. And so the priest wanted to avoid any kind of repercussions for himself or his community by breaking the law, quote unquote, by going and touching the dead man. A second man comes along who's a Levite, who's kind of another priestly figure in the Jewish religion, who also passes by on the other side. It's actually the book of Numbers is in the Old Testament, says whoever touches a human corpse will be unclean for 7 days, Numbers 19:11. So the questioner and the community that's hearing him tell this, a small group, is familiar with that kind of edict from ancient Judaism.
Interesting.
And then a certain Samaritan, so the third traveler, comes by, and when he sees the man, he was moved with compassion. He comes to him and bounds up his wounds. He pours oil and wine on him, puts him on his donkey, takes him to an inn. He even not only does he deliver him to the inn, he gives the innkeeper money and says 2 denarii, which is a decent amount of money, And he says, take care of this man. Whatever you spend beyond that, I'll pay you when I return.
Wow.
And the significance of the Samaritan doing the right thing is what's so radical about the story. So in first century Judea, Jews and Samaritans were not cool. They were a despised, to quote one of my professors, a despised ethnic outcast. They were a neighboring community, and they'd gone to war with the Jews a couple hundred years prior. So there's a feud between Jews and Samaritans. And so, in fact, in John, some of the Pharisees accused Jesus of being a demon-possessed Samaritan.
Wow.
It kind of colors how harsh that their portrayals and their perspective of Samaritans were. So then he tells the story, and he says, now, which of these three do you think seemed to be a neighbor to him who fell among the robbers? And the man says, he who showed mercy on him. And Jesus says, go and do likewise.
Wow.
And so, the jaws on the floor of everybody who heard this, that this teacher a Jewish teacher, by the way, Jesus was a Jew, lived and died a Jew, that he's putting down his own religion's leaders and lifting up, essentially an enemy as doing the right thing, because the Samaritan is not beholden to that law. And I think what a lot of, maybe getting ahead of myself here, but what avatars do, I'm comfortable considering Jesus an avatar. Right?
Yeah, me too.
Hindu term, we've talked about this, but Krishna, Buddha, Christ, there's a few of them, and it's a divine figure. It's someone it's a man or a woman who breaks the veil, who kind of empties their separation, ego, individuality, and so on. And so what the avatar does, what the master does, is they're correcting the misconceptions or the wooden rigidity of the institution of that day that's become too obsessed with kind of surface level rules and dogma and so on, that, oh, wait a second, we've gotten too far away, from the real true spiritual message here. And so the avatar is kind of sledgehammering the status quo in a really powerful kind of myth bust type of way. And so, I love that story. It's a profound.
Yeah.
I quote in my book, Martin Luther King said, the first question which the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Good Samaritan reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?
It's almost like a version of karma, in a sense, he was tapping into.
Totally. Yes. Karma yoga. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. That's profound. I don't, I've heard of the idea of the Good Samaritan, of course. Who hasn't?
Yeah. But, like a hospital, charities, and kind of the modern culture is kind of deadened.
Yes.
The meaning.
And I only knew of it in that way until just now, it's really cool to learn more of the history of that.
Let me give you one last note on that, which is important to clarify, which is the sad thing about this parable is, because it's so beautiful and so profound, is that this parable has been used throughout the millennia by anti-Semites because it's essentially criticizing the Jewish leaders, despite him being a Jew. And the irony is he was a Jewish teacher himself, and he was criticizing his own religion's hypocrisy in that time period. It doesn't justify racism against the Jewish people, obviously. It's actually a call to see beyond racial and cultural differences. It's a teaching of unity. So it's a cruel irony that it's been picked up by hateful people. Really, right. The worst of the worst. You know who I'm talking about, have used that parable.
Absolutely.
And I just want to be clear, because there's a good friend of mine who's a Jewish mystic, and we've had a conversation. I mentioned wanting to do something with this parable, and he said, you know what, that's a touchy one. And so anyway, wanted to color that, but ultimately it's a beautiful message.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And I wanted to say too, this story happened past his baptism. Is that right?
Yeah. So that's during his ministry when
Okay,
he
got it.
was approached. That is Luke 10:25 to 37. So, somewhere in the middle. I'm not exactly sure, but
Gotcha.
he has a couple of years there where he's moving throughout the countryside. He starts out in Nazareth, gets baptized at the Jordan, and then he's kind of just this country rabbi, if you will, until he winds up in Jerusalem. It gets pretty dramatic there at the end, obviously.
Yeah.
But,
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I do wonder, had he heard. I mean, I know there were probably mystics, obviously religious people, that he had been exposed to. I wonder, had he heard of Buddha, or had he heard of any other traditions that inspired him, so to speak, or was this kind of just a novel, right? It's like, let's be a good person. It's like, I think that's pretty easy to believe, that you could just come to some sense of morality in a time where it was more rare. But what is your take on that before we move on to the next
Well,
one?
it's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer with a lot of scholarly context. I mean, what I can say is that it's a province of the Roman Empire, and so it's actually not that isolated. I think there's a lot of pros and cons of the Roman Empire, right? A lot of advancement, a lot of cultural exchange, and then there's a lot of cruelty and barbarism and so on. But also, it was this big kind of melting pot. It's the first, America says, well, no, the Roman Empire is the first one. It was very through conquest. The Greeks and the Romans had traversed a lot of those continents in that period. So the Hellenistic period, which is right there adjacent to Jesus's time, is a very rich cultural, diverse exchange of ideas. Egypt is right there. The India and the Far East aren't that further along. There's actually, to your question about Buddha and in Indian kind of presence, Alexander the Great got to India first. He's the first Greco-Roman to get there, and he met yogis. And this is 300 years before Jesus. So he even brought a couple back. There was a guy named Kalanos, which is the Greek name, that's the Greekized version of this yogi's name. But Kalanos was a kind of a Hindu mentor to Alexander the Great 300 years prior. So historically, we do have, evidence that there was cultural exchanges, and that, there was borrowing and sharing and learning across cultures at that time.
Right. Yeah, as a quick aside, that gives me a little context as to how Alexander the Great may have been so impressed by Diogenes, because he had seen yogis, but Diogenes wasn't. I mean, he was kind of a Greek yogi, I suppose we could call him.
Yeah, sure.
Greek mystic. But I remember Alexander the Great going up to Diogenes and saying, if I weren't Alexander the Great, I would be Diogenes.
Right.
And it was because he asked him, what do you want? I'll give you anything you want. And he said, step out of my sunlight.
Right. You're in my sun right now, but little man. That's very cool. Yeah, it was very good.
Love that story.
Love that story. Yeah, the ancient Greeks, what's interesting, I'm jumping ahead here, but to your point of kind of Greek philosophy tying into kind of some of these ideas, is that the Nag Hammadi library, which is, one of the most significant discoveries of the 20th century, we found basically two different caches of texts in the 40s. By we, I mean humanity. There's different stories for each one, but we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was the Essenes, and then the Nag Hammadi library, which is nearby in Egypt, that it's outside of Alexandria. We found 52 different documents in these books. They're leather-bound books, and that's where we get the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John. Incredible list, kind of the Gnostic best greatest hits, if you will. And what's funny about it is one of the texts that was found in the Nag Hammadi library is Plato's Republic. So these Gnostic Christians, these kind of mystic Jesus followers, were also reading Plato. They, again, back to the cultural exchange, there was a rich melting pot of ideas. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. Incredible. Well, in interest of, keeping this somewhat timely and back to Jesus. Yeah. Unless there's any more particular parables, I would want to jump into the idea of how Jesus spoke in code.
Yeah.
It seemed that, and you told me this on our pre-chat, that when he would speak to groups of people, he would put forth maybe simpler ideas that were easier to comprehend.
Yeah.
But when he would speak to certain people, he would kind of code his message. Not only do I wonder how and why he did that, but does the Bible do that itself? Because I've certainly heard that there are like levels or tiers to the reading of the Bible. There's a very like religious fundamentalist way to read it. And there is a more mystic, more Gnostic, more non-dual way to read it as well. So what do these ideas bring up for you?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think all spiritual texts have symbolic meaning. And I think the beauty of spiritual texts is that they are perfectly appropriate to the individual reading it, right? It's like, if you're, just not to be too patronizing here, but so whatever. But, it's like if you're in kindergarten, you're going to get a certain read. If you're in 6th grade, you're going to get a certain read. If you're in 12th grade, you're going to get a certain read. And sometimes, a lot of people that I know, and certainly me in my own experience, is like, sometimes when you go back and read passages years later, you unlock a whole new sense of understanding about it based on your own growth and based on your own spiritual progress, right? So,
yeah,
there's just a lot of transformative power in understanding that kind of iceberg quality, what's underneath this in a deeper way. And, admittedly, like I said, student of Bible scholarship, deep bow, and I have a lot of reverence and respect for academia and what these guys and gals have been doing for the last couple of hundred years. Really, early 1800s is what is called the quest for the historical Jesus. We started reading all this stuff as human texts, as historical text, as opposed to like we had for the previous 1800, 1700 years, as the thing, as the chiseled in stone divine teaching to man. And, we've gotten a lot of new understanding about it. So that said, I haven't really seen too much of an emphasis on this within scholarship. I know it's there. My other kind of area of expertise is the world mystic traditions, right? World mystic teachers. And so I've read, Yogananda on Jesus, and Thich Nhat Hanh on Jesus, and Swami Prabhavananda on Jesus. And so Vivekananda actually is who I quote at the top of this paragraph. I have a subchapter in my book called Layers of the Teaching. Mm-hmm. And Vivekananda puts it really nice, who was a Swami in the late 1800s. He says, to the masses who could not conceive of anything higher than a personal God, he said, pray to your Father in heaven. To others who could grasp a higher idea, he said, I am the vine, you are the branches. But to his disciples, to whom he revealed himself more fully, he proclaimed the highest truth. I and my Father are one. Right? So there's this kind of stair step of he knows the master knows, you know,
Right.
the level of receptivity of the audience that you're talking to. And, you know, I think, like I said, I think scholars are more aware of this idea in terms of who the audience is.
Yeah.
It doesn't really come up that much in church. I'm not a Christian. I don't go, I go to Unity Church every once in a while. They're great, but I'm a little bit outside of the American church community. However, my experiences with that world, not a lot of discussion on who the audience is in terms of the meaning and how to interpret it from literal to figurative, kind of on the sliding scale.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, Mark and Matthew mention this in the text. Mark, it says, when he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables. So, you know, the way I kind of break it down in the book is like the very large crowds, like the Sermon on the Mount is his big amphitheater, you know, hundreds, thousands of people. That's where he says, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And then the smaller groups where he can kind of get across a deeper teaching, that's the parables. But he doesn't necessarily know those people very well. They're strangers, they're coming up. And so, you know, like I said, it's dangerous. He's criticizing the Jewish priest. He's criticizing aspects of the Old Testament, the law itself. Mm-hmm. You know, he famously picked crop on the Sabbath, which is, I mean, he was a rule breaker in many ways. And so he's using parables as a literary device to cloak the deeper truth. Whereas when he's with the disciples, when he's with the homies, with whom they're spending all their time, you know, around the campfire at night, that's when we get, you know, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He says in John, before Abraham was, I am. Right? So he's not talking about, you know, that being kind of the third level, the most intimate perspective. Before Abraham was, I am. So Abraham is the ancient father figure of Judaism, right?
Yeah.
He's not talking about this body, this man, Jesus. That's impossible. He's talking about his own, you know, maybe to use a more contemporary term here, his own unity consciousness, his own connective I am state of unconditional love, of eternal presence, of, you know, feeling the beating cosmic heart of all creation. That is before I am. That's before Abraham. Whereas, you know, I think what some of my disagreements with Christian institution and Christian doctrine is that they really, you know, worship this man and his body, and they've kind of created this icon, they've created the icon of his body and his personhood. And I think to the mystics like me and others, Christian, you know, mystic Christians and other faith traditions, you know, we see that he was indicating his own higher self, his own I am consciousness that is pervasive in eternity. And he just connected with that. And I think what he's doing is he's teaching us how to do it yourself. He's saying, this is how to act. This is how to live. This is how you can have a relationship with God who loves you unconditionally.
Right. Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the version of Jesus that I feel called to research and understand more as well. Absolutely. The mystic Jesus, you know, and I have a sense of faith and believe that there is some truth to his life and his story. And it's not just a myth. That I believe he was a real person. I mean, I don't know whether or not like that shawl or blanket that they found that had his face imprinted on
Shroud of Turin.
Was it real? You know, I don't know. But part of me believes that there was a guy, you know, there was a guy that did this. But but yeah, it did. We discussed this in the first podcast episode, episode one of these two that we're doing, about how the church kind of runs away with the story to create a power structure, which is not, they're not the only people doing that. I mean, that's happening all over the place, from taxes to presidents to everything, right? But to get back to these couple ideas, I have two more really kind of more interesting questions. And one was about the 40 days in the desert. Do you know much about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the, funny enough, talking about parallels between other faith traditions, the Buddha meditates under the Bodhi tree for 40 days. There's a spiritual significance to 40 days. But yeah, it's, I think Joseph Campbell talks most poetically about Jesus's temptation, and, it's a core part of his being tested by the world. In the Bible, it's by the devil. He's offered all these things, so is the Buddha. The Buddha's offered, women and power and, all these things by Maya. By Mara, the temptress. And so there's a level of kind of avoiding, or not avoiding, actually, specifically declining worldly temptation. And, I think the mystics view it's like being caught in the fly trap of samsara, if you will, the stickiness of this world and its external opportunities for pleasure and pain, and kind of the wheel of samsara, right? And so Jesus makes that's a chapter in the hero's journey of him going out to really demonstrate his attainment and his capacity to transcend temptation.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. And was that prior to or after the baptism?
That's after.
After again. Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's on the journey.
Yeah, so part of me could also believe the idea that was what led him to his knowledge. But there was other things that, I guess I wonder.
It's early. It's actually right after. Yeah, it's right after that. I wanted to verify that. It's right after the baptism.
Okay, got it. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, the other one that we talked about discussing is the resurrection. Did it occur? If so, how? And you said there were potentially other mystics who have been through this resurrection type of thing. So I think that's a big topic. Very interesting. Very interesting.
Well, yeah. Happy Easter, everybody. This is really a view that it takes a decent amount of context. I think Christians, oftentimes I'll get comments where Christians are saying, that's all well and good that there's other teachers that teach love, and that's nice, but they didn't come back from the dead, buddy.
Yeah.
And my, humble response is, well, you haven't read the world mystic traditions, because it does happen. It does occur. I personally do, as a mystic. I mean, and, I think it's almost like the secular people think I'm crazy for believing he came back from the dead. Yeah. And then the Christians think I'm crazy for believing other people have done it. Nobody's happy here. But, essentially the idea is that when you break the veil, all the mystics, and I think in as I try to demonstrate in the book, some of Jesus's own teachings talk about the illusory nature of this world, the dreamlike quality of this world is a common theme across mystic philosophy and all these teachers. And so the idea is, when you break the veil, you are able to kind of manipulate time and space in some ways. You're less, you're not caught in the net of the conditioning of this plane. You go up higher in some capacity. And yes, I believe that. I actually do think that he kind of completed his enlightenment, if you will, on the cross. And we were talking about his last words. In my view, really the main one that's worth really sincere contemplation is, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." Him forgiving his killers. He's being brutally murdered, and he essentially says, it's not that big a deal.
Wow.
I mean, it's one of the most sublime utterances in human civilization, and that to me is indicative of the enlightened human. The enlightened person that is completely untouchable, invincible to the external world. So he transcends, and it's chaos. The disciples are scared, run away. The women stay there, by the way. Shout out. The women stay at the cross, and the boys run away. And in each of the Gospels is different. There's contradictions, right, in the Gospels. It's not this one cohesive narrative, but so different folks come to who's guarding the tomb, but typically it's the women that actually see the risen Jesus first. And he comes back and he says, "This is me, and I'm fine, and I transcended the body, and don't you worry about it. I'm done. It is finished."
Yeah.
And so it's a very powerful thing, and I don't make light of it, and I understand its significance. My main disagreement with Christian doctrine, maybe is that his crucifixion and resurrection is the salvation of all humanity in terms of our soul's work being done, or it's like Jesus did that, and therefore we're all good to go. And warmly, humbly, without trying to offend people here, I don't think that's the case. I think he was demonstrating the potentiality for all beings to do that. And he's a big brother, in a sense, in terms that we're all children of God. We're all children of Creator. We all have this capacity to do what he did by the way that by example. There's a famous 15th century text called The Imitation of Christ, Thomas à Kempis. Like you're supposed to imitate, you're supposed to model your life after this person and become like him, become like his relationship to Creator and unity consciousness and so on, versus kind of he's out there, and a lot of Christians say, "I'm not Jesus, I can't." Well, that's true, and it's not true. Like you aren't Jesus right now, because we're kind of stuck in our own egos, and we would, if the devil came to you in the desert and offered you the world, you might take it, so then maybe we all have some work to do, and that's okay. But our own inherent potentiality is infinite. I think that's the lesson of the mystics, and that's the lesson of the Gnostics in some way. And that's why there was early issues between the first Christians of the Orthodox and the first Christian Gnostics. But to your point, it's happened in other stories. Milarepa, for example, was a Tibetan Buddhist monk who allegedly died and came back to being visible to his disciples, and kind of gave a final teaching in the cave in the 1100 time period in Tibet. Also 1,000 years ago, also hard to verify. The most modern one that we have, a first-person eyewitness account that is in great detail, is an autobiography of a yogi, which is written by the late, great Paramahansa Yogananda, who I dedicate the book to. He's a giant spiritual master of the modern era. And
100%.
We could do another pod on him, but he buries his guru in Puri in India, and 2 months later he's in a hotel in India, and he sees Krishna. The beginning of the morning, he sees Krishna on another, like top of a building, like on the horizon, dancing, and then he disappears. And he goes, "Oh wow, okay." And that's a little synchronistic sign that, hey, the veil's about to break. Strap in. And a couple hours later, his guru, Sri Yukteswar, materializes in front of his eyes.
Yeah.
He goes and hugs him, and he hugs him for like kind of an awkward amount of time. The master says, "Okay, let's talk." And so it's chapter 44, the resurrection of Sri Yukteswar. It's they have a really deep conversation. You can Google it online for free. It's in Autobiography of Yogi, but basically Sri Yukteswar kind of contextualizes what I said earlier. Like when you're done on this plane of time and space, you've learned all your lessons, you've forgiven it all, you've transcended temptation, so on.
Right.
You go up to a higher realm. There's higher realms, sometimes they're called astral realms or light planes, thought planes, and so on. The Tibetans actually, I think, have a pretty rich cosmology in terms of their navigation of these realms.
Yeah.
And so other mystic traditions, the Kabbalists, there's no shortage. But Sri Yukteswar, kind of highlights that, and then he dematerializes. And so, it's that's my belief, is that I'm definitely open to Jesus coming back based on his attainment, which was so powerful and so profound. And I think that, it got misread a little bit. The Jews are hoping for a Messiah. And so that's a big part of the crucifixion and resurrection, to kind of fight against Rome. They want this kingly warrior figure who's a son of David, who is born in Bethlehem, who, that's prophesied. And so the, kind of what Christian scholars or scholarship within the Bible, New Testament scholars will say is that a lot of these characteristics of Jesus were kind of put on him by the gospel writers, who are just, kind of further inventing this level of his, making their own character of a historical teacher.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, the ideas that come up for me when we think of the resurrection in both cases that we just went through, or even all three, is it the body physically reanimating, or is it a kind of light body version that they're encountering? So it'd be like an energetic body.
Like a force ghost?
Yeah, like a ghost. Something like a ghost.
Like a Jedi?
Yeah, exactly. So do you think when he resurrected, just more talking about Jesus, that it was like his body, his heart started again, like Jon Snow in Game of Thrones, right? It's like he physically came back, or was it perhaps he spiritually, light body materialized and came back?
That's a great question, and I do not know.
Mm-hmm. What do you think seems more likely?
Well, he allegedly had the wounds of the cross, but I think it could go either way, in that it was either his physical body coming back to life, or the atoms, rematerialize in the matrix, recreating the way he was killed. In John, there's a kind of funny little moment where Thomas doubts that it's him, doubting Thomas. You might have heard that term. And, Thomas kind of touches the wounds of, in order to verify that it's indeed him. And again, context from the Bible scholars is that the John community, the Gospel of John community at that period, was in conflict with the Thomas community. And so the Johannine and the Thomasine communities are at odds with each other. And so the Gospel of John, they're going to make Thomas look like a jerk, which is like that. It's so political. I mean, it's that political that early on. It's like the gospel writers are elevating and de-elevating, different characters, including Jesus himself, based on their own aims. But yeah, I mean, I think long story short, I don't know. It's hard for me to say, but I'm open to either. I just think he came back. I think that's radical enough for me to stand by.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think we can have dreams, even waking dreams, of people who have passed. I'm sure people have seen their grandmother, their grandfather, their mom, their dad in some type, and I'm not going to call it like a delusion, but like a dream. When you're having a dream, it's as real as normal reality.
Right.
And there are things such as waking dreams that is like scientifically proven. So I almost have no doubt that they experienced, through one way or another, Jesus coming back. But the big question, and I wonder if we'll ever get any insight on this, or if we just won't, it'll just be a mystery, is, was it physically him in that same body, or was it some type of materialization through the mind of the observers? Or even just like the straight up light body? Because, we discussed Babaji, who is Yogananda's kind of guru, so to speak. I mean, he had many, but this guy apparently can materialize and dematerialize. That's how advanced of a yogi he is. Is it a magic trick? Is it real? It's hard to say, but, certainly things like magic exist. They exist for a reason. We're fascinated by magic tricks for a reason. It's deep within our DNA that these type of supernatural occurrences have happened, have always happened. If we are in a simulation or a matrix, I would say there are glitches. There are moments that just defy logic and you just can't understand them. So those are the couple ideas that come floating up for me about the resurrection, perhaps of all of these guys, but also with some level of spiritual attainment. Let's call it the full activation of your organs, the pineal, the pituitary, the chakras, they're linked to. You could, like you said, break the veil and be able to do kind of things that are just completely otherworldly and supernatural, and like appear again or re-enter your body and these type of things.
Yeah, no, great points. And like, you're definitely like peeling the layers back on, like, in my view, like world mystic philosophy, and really it's called non-duality, right? So non-duality
Sure.
is means not two. There's only one.
Right.
And Shankara, who is a famous Advaita Swami, he says, you never identify yourself with the shadow cast by your body, or with its reflection, or with the body you see in a dream or in your imagination. Therefore, you should not identify yourself with this living body either.
Yeah.
There's so much language in, Advaita and Zen and Sufism and, all these different esoteric traditions that talk about the illusory nature of this world, of this realm. I call it like the external world or the material world. It's and science is starting to point to it. I kind of put a disclaimer in my book that I'm not. I think that one of the issues in kind of contemporary spirituality, new age, if you will, to use the scary term, but in contemporary spirituality, there's a lot of connections with quantum and quantum physics. And I think there's a level of that is legitimate. And I think there's a level of it that's a little bit hyperbolic in terms of the connection between. So I'm hesitant I'll never come out and say, oh, quantum physics proves all this. That's not fair. Like, that's not fair to physicists. But
yeah,
I do think it is pretty interesting when you read like Max Planck and like Heisenberg and, and even Einstein. It's like they say some pretty far out mystical shit where they're like, it's not really real, actually. It's like, we were wrong. Sorry, everybody. We thought that there was a real tangible foundational quality to this. And we actually realized once you keep zooming in, and I think shout out Don Hoffman, PhD, Bernardo Castro, PhD. A couple of these guys have been on Michael, Third Eye Drops podcast, our buddy. He's interviewed a decent amount of like kind of spiritually open-minded scientists who are brainiac scientists, geniuses,
100%.
who are like, yeah, it's, we just keep zooming in. We keep zooming in and there's nothing there. And so
Yeah,
what the hell's going on, basically?
1,000%. Well, so many people that have mind-blowing mystical experiences come back and say it's all light.
Mm-hmm.
This is all light. And it's kind of almost like light has densities. And the physical world and our physical body is that of just like maybe I don't know if it's lower or higher vibrating density, but it's certainly a different density than the cosmic oneness that is projecting these realities before us. And so, with that in mind, and quantum reality in mind, it could just be Jesus coming back in a different form of light than the physical body type of thing.
I think that I'm comfortable, with that explanation. If it's like it's all light anyway.
Right. 100%. Me too. I love it, man. Well, if there's any final ideas you want to explore, I'm happy to. But those got a lot of my questions answered, and I'm stoked to have you again and to be able to do this with you, man. And I'm sure I'll be seeing you soon in Austin. So,
thank you, man. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your interest. And I think you and the listener for my lecture series here. Hopefully, I kept it accessible.
Absolutely.
But yeah. Big fan of Jesus, and it's it's funny because it's like in some ways I've almost become this like Jesus defender, or it's like, or I'm like, Jehovah's Witness or something knocking on someone's door. You want to talk about Jesus? And it's like I don't mean like that. It's like I'm not trying to convert anyone. I'm not trying to persuade anyone. I'm just, this is my experience and proximity to these texts, and I think understanding him and trying to integrate his teachings along with the masters throughout history is transformative. Absolutely. And highly recommend further study and contemplation.
Right. Aside from your book, Original Sin is a Lie, do you recommend a certain version of the Bible, or just maybe even a book that distills for more of our lens,
Yeah. Well, there's a few. I mean, I think on the scholarship side, if anyone's interested more in like the historical Jesus, there's a great documentary on PBS Frontline that one of my old professors is a prominent interviewer in, who helped co-write, called From Jesus to Christ.
Okay.
So free on YouTube. It's about 20 years old, and so it's kind of funny, but it's really well done, and it paints a really beautiful picture of ancient Judea, formation of the Gospels, kind of the early Christian formation, and also the works of Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman is he's a Bible scholar who is very unique in that he has best-selling books. So he's written a couple of books that the public reads, which is rare for scholars. So anything by him, misquoting Jesus is a really good one that's, explains in greater detail kind of some of the contradictions and some of the human elements. And then on the, spiritual side, I mean, Yogananda is great. I think, Yoga of Jesus is his condensed version of the second coming of Christ, Resurrection Within You, which is his commentary basically on the New Testament. So you can kind of read Jesus' teachings from a mystical view.
Yeah.
I haven't read it, but Marianne Williamson just put out supposedly a really good book about Jesus too.
Cool.
Recently, I think it's called Mystical Jesus. But
got it. Okay.
Yeah, she's great. And my book, I mean, I recommend. I'm citing everybody, so my book is kind of a good. You'll buy a bunch more books after you read mine.
Awesome. Well, brother, thank you once again for being here. Thank you to all the listeners.
Thanks, buddy.
Yes, sir. All right, guys. We'll see you on the next episode. Cheers.